This is an overview for Project 7, a carbon fiber bicycle fork. The fork consists of two blades, a crown where the blades meet, and a steering tube. At the bottom of each blade is a dropout plate which is nicely blended in to the blade itself, and the dropout slot where the axle of the front wheel passes through. Most of this project uses techniques that you're already familiar with. For example, the first step is going to involve using an inserted master model that controls the geometry of the fork and will later on be used to control the geometry of a frame. The blades will be made using boundaries with 4 guide curves and a series of profile sketches. The fork ends will be simple extrudes, but because they go straight up and down and the blades angle into them, you'll actually be using a small boundary in order to blend the two together. The crown, if you wish, can also be blended into the two blades using a boundary as well, or you can do a simpler shaped crown. Finally, the steering tube is just an extrude with a thin wall. Although a real carbon fiber fork is mostly hollow, we are just going to be building ours out of solid cross sections, and the only hollow section will be the thin-walled steering tube. There's only one new feature in this project that you've not used on previous projects, and that is going to be to use a swept cut. We're going to use that swept cut in order to blend the curvature of the blade into the curvature of the leading and trailing edge of the dropout plate. One of the trickiest parts about this project is that the entire fork is tilted at an angle, which means that you're going to be working on some unfamiliar planes that are not at 90 degrees to any of your familiar planes. You're going to be having to make a plane which is tilted so that it passes through the axis of the steering tube, another plane perpendicular to that, which sits on the top of the crown. For most of the construction of this project, you will be working just on these two tilted planes and the front plane. So you're going to have to get used to working in an unusual orientation. Another challenging part of this project is to build the guide curves to be used for making the blades. Each blade is going to have 4 guide curves. The guide curve at the leading edge of the blade, right on the center line, a guide curve on the trailing edge along the center line, and then a guide curve that's going to be on the outside of the blade, again going on the center line, and a similar curve on the inside of the blade along the center line of the blade. I will make the guide curves visible so you can see what I'm talking about. Here you see the leading edge guide curve, the outer guide curve, the trailing edge guide curve, and the inner guide curve. Rolling back so we just see the guide curves and the profiles. This will be the profile of the blade on the front plane, and then we will add the necessary number of profiles going down from the top of the blade down to the very end where the fork end will be. In this case, I needed a total of 4 profiles that all have pierce relations to the guide curves. You might need more or less, but you'll at least need one here, one down here, and almost certainly one here after the blade turns the corner. Each guide curve is constructed as a projected curve, requiring, of course, 2 sketches for each projection. So you have a series of sketches you're going to have to make in your layouts, and then go through a series of projections to make the guide curves. This is going to be some of the major work that you're going to encounter in this project. Once you've gone through all that work, you'll just be able to make a boundary out of these guide curves and profiles. Then you're going to work on the fork end. I'm going to trim away any excess that you don't need and also make a little tapering cut in order to taper the end of the blade into the dropout plate. I'm going to make the dropout plate or fork end a little bit oversized. Then you're going to add the dropout slot. And this is where you're going to use the swept cut. You're actually going to use the outer edge of the oversized fork end as a path. You're going to be copying this curve here, which is part of the shape of the blade. You'll use that to make a swept cut that's going to take away this excess material and blend this edge of the fork end into the blade. And you'll be doing the same back here. So just showing what that looks like. Our first swept cut takes away that excess material, and then this curvature matches this curvature. The second one does the same for this edge of the fork end. These meet at a slight angle. They aren't blended together or tangent, so we're going to take a little trick where we remove a little gap and then build a brand new boundary that is going to go from this surface to this surface and be made tangent to all the surfaces around. That gives us our nice blend through this area. And that's a matter of just finishing this up with some nice fillets. Most of the work is done at this point. Just mirror the blade with the fork ends. Cut off some material at the top for the crown. Then we'll build a boundary for the crown that blends into the blades on either side and in the front and the back. Finally, we add the extrusion for the steering tube. And then finally, just a little finishing fillet on the top of the crown. To be successful with this project, you will have to be very careful about how you build your layout sketches. There are primarily just two layout sketches that control everything. The first is the view of the fork on the front plane, and the other is the view of the fork on the tilted right-hand plane. Key alignments need to be made at the top of the blade between the two sketches. Here we see in the front layout a diamond shape which represents the corners of where my profile is going to go for the first profile of the blade boundary. When I look at the sketch on the tilted right plane, we see that this curve has to go right exactly to the top of the diamond, this curve has to go exactly to the bottom, and this one goes right to the very middle. Down at the fork end, we have some critical alignments to be made as well. Here we have the center of the fork dropout slot, which is where the front axle passes through. And this needs to be aligned with the view in the tilted right plane. So this is where the axle will go through when viewed from this orientation. We have the bottom of the fork end, which needs to align with the bottom of the fork end in this view. And this is the area where the blade tapers down to the flat dropout plate. So this line here needs to be aligned with this line here. So in later videos, you'll see some tricks for making sure that that happens. That's all the detail I'll give for now in this introductory video. Now it's time to move on to the second video where we will actually start constructing the fork.